What if everything you think you know about ancient tribal societies is built on a version of history that was deliberately edited, softened, and rewritten to erase the power women once held? Imagine this for a moment. Entire regions once organized around female leadership, councils guided by elder women, and societies where authority was shared, or even centered on women, simply vanishing from the official record. Why would someone bury a past like that? And more importantly, what does it reveal about the brutal transformations that shape the world we live in now? The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that what was destroyed of tribal female leadership was not an accident or a slow cultural shift, but a violent, calculated dismantling that targeted the social structures women had built for thousands of years. Structures that held communities together, managed resources, resolved conflicts, and protected traditions that predated written history. Picture a time when influence was not measured by force, but by wisdom. In countless tribal societies, women served as mediators, diplomats, spiritual guides, healers, and strategic decision-makers. They shaped alliances, maintained social balance, and carried responsibilities that today would be considered political power. These roles did not disappear naturally. They were taken, and the methods used to suppress them were far more extreme than most people imagine. As expanding patriarchal systems spread across territories, they clashed directly with women-led structures that contradicted their worldview. Instead of coexistence, the result was domination. Confiscated spaces, silenced voices, forbidden rituals, and entire lines of leadership erased through fear, violence, and forced restructuring of communities. But the most disturbing part is how effectively these changes were hidden behind sanitized narratives. Later historians portrayed these transitions as harmless cultural evolution, not the brutal dismantling of female authority carried out through punishment, coercion, and imposed hierarchies. When you start to uncover what was truly destroyed, you begin to understand how deeply these losses impacted spiritual life, political systems, and the survival strategies of entire peoples. And once you see the scale of that destruction, you cannot unsee it. It forces you to question what else was rewritten, what else was buried, and what this means for understanding the past with honesty instead of convenience. You already feel the weight of that question, and this is only the beginning, because what comes next goes even deeper into the hidden violence that shaped history as we know it. Before we continue, tell me what this awakening stirs in you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Make sure you like this video, and check if you're already subscribed so you do not lose the next revelations that build on what you just heard. The next part pulls you further into what was taken from these women, moving naturally from what was erased to how it was destroyed. The moment you begin to examine how early matrilineal societies were dismantled, a disturbing pattern emerges. These were not isolated disruptions or quiet cultural substitutions. They were coordinated shifts enforced through pressure, violence, and the strategic rewriting of social order. Many of these communities had long been guided by female lineage, where property, authority, and inheritance passed through mothers, grandmothers, and ancestral female lines. This structure created stability, continuity, and a powerful sense of identity that rooted generations to the wisdom of women who served as custodians of knowledge. But when outside forces arrived, these systems became immediate targets because they represented a form of power resistant to conquest. Slowly at first, then aggressively, the traditional balance was disrupted. Male-centered groups imposed their own rules, often beginning with small changes that seemed insignificant at the time. The right to speak in councils was restricted. Ritual spaces guarded by women were seized. Ceremonies that celebrated female lineage were labeled primitive or dangerous. And gradually, the mechanisms that once upheld women as leaders were replaced with structures that placed men at the center of authority. What had been a shared or female-focused distribution of power became a hierarchy that pushed women into silence, reshaping the entire foundation of community life. The methods varied between regions, but the goal was always the same: to remove women from positions that granted influence over political, spiritual, and economic decisions. The erasure was not only physical, but symbolic. Stories were reinterpreted to prioritize male figures. Ancestral women who once represented protection and continuity became background characters, or vanished entirely from the oral record. Myths were adjusted to justify the new order, portraying male dominance as natural, inevitable, or divinely ordained. This ideological shift was essential because it replaced memory with obedience. Once the story changed, resisting the new structure became almost impossible. And the most striking detail is how quickly these changes spread. One generation could remember a world shaped by the voices of women, while the next grew up believing those roles never existed. The loss happened in plain sight, but few dared question it, because challenging the new system brought consequences that were severe and sometimes fatal. Even in communities that attempted to preserve traces of their old ways, the pressure from external powers made resistance dangerous. Yet beneath the surface, fragments of that former order continued to live through whispers, hidden practices, and teachings passed quietly from mothers to daughters. Those fragments reveal just how much was taken, and how deeply the disruption reached across every aspect of life. The more you uncover these buried transitions, the easier it becomes to see that the destruction of matrilineal structures was not the side effect of progress. It was a deliberate dismantling of a system that empowered women to shape the destiny of their people. And understanding how these early foundations were overturned is essential to grasp the full magnitude of what would happen next, as the assault on female leadership expanded into spiritual life, healing knowledge, and the very identity of entire tribes. As the old, matrilineal structures were stripped away, the next target became the spiritual authority women carried within their tribal worlds. For thousands of years, spirituality was not a detached institution, but a living pulse intertwined with daily life, and women were often its core interpreters. They served as vision keepers, ritual leaders, dream interpreters, and protectors of practices that maintained harmony between the community and the natural world. Their roles did not rely on physical force, but on knowledge, intuition, and ancestral memory. This form of influence posed a profound threat to groups seeking to impose a rigid, male-centered hierarchy. Removing women from these spiritual positions was not merely symbolic. It was a calculated attempt to dismantle the identity of entire tribes. The transformation was subtle at first. Women were told they could continue their rituals, but only under supervision. Their sacred objects were confiscated and replaced with new symbols aligned with the rising patriarchal order. Ritual spaces once guarded by female elders were repurposed, taken over, or declared forbidden. Any ceremony that emphasized female power, fertility, protection, or lineage was reinterpreted as backward, chaotic, or dangerous. What had once been celebrated as a source of collective strength was suddenly painted as a threat that needed control. This shift did not come from genuine concern, but from a deep fear of losing dominance over the spiritual imagination of the community. In many tribes, women had served as intermediaries between the tangible and the unseen. They guided decisions, predicted natural cycles, healed through spiritual insight, and maintained bonds with the ancestors. To take these roles away meant ripping out the emotional and symbolic foundation of communal life. And yet, that is exactly what happened. New authorities declared that only male figures could speak to the divine or interpret sacred knowledge. Women who had once been honored were pushed aside, silenced, and sometimes threatened into compliance. Under this pressure, generations grew up believing that only men could guide the spiritual destiny of the tribe, forgetting entirely the centuries in which women shaped this path. But the most insidious part was the rewriting of meaning. Rituals originally created by women were preserved but stripped of their female-centered purpose. Some were reassigned to male leaders, who altered them to reinforce their authority. Others were erased entirely from cultural memory. Myths were adjusted so that female spiritual figures became symbols of temptation, weakness, or danger. Male heroes replaced female guardians in the stories, turning wisdom into obedience and turning balance into domination. Over time, the worldview of the tribe shifted, not because the community chose this transformation, but because it was forced upon them with precision and intent. Yet beneath these imposed structures, women continued to carry fragments of the old teachings. They preserved small rituals in secret, whispered prayers in hidden spaces, and passed down pieces of knowledge that survived despite the attempts to erase them. These fragments became the last threads of a world that once honored their spiritual leadership. And the more you explore how drastically this shift reshaped tribal identity, the more you begin to see the darker mechanisms that would soon unfold as female healers, guardians of knowledge, and keepers of ancestral memory became direct targets of a new and rising form of punishment. The moment female spiritual authority was pushed into secrecy, the next stage of repression unfolded with a level of brutality that reshaped entire cultural landscapes. Women who had once been respected as healers, midwives, herbalists, and guardians of medicinal knowledge suddenly found themselves accused of threatening the new order. Healing was never simply a practical task. It was a form of influence that touched every stage of life, from birth to illness to death. Those who controlled healing controlled survival itself. And because women had held this knowledge for generations, dismantling their authority became essential for those who wished to dominate communities from the inside out. At first, the attacks were subtle. Men were encouraged to take over practices previously guided by women. Healing rituals were rewritten, stripped of their female-centered origins, and reframed as crude or misguided. Women were told they lacked the right to make decisions involving illness or spiritual imbalance. Tools that had belonged to female healers were confiscated or redirected to male practitioners. Over time, small insults and restrictions grew into organized campaigns designed to discredit everything that came from female hands. The new power structures needed the community to distrust the women who had once protected them, because trust is one of the strongest forms of authority. Then came the accusations. Any woman who continued to treat the sick, interpret dreams, or offer spiritual guidance became an easy target. If a child died despite her efforts, she was blamed. If a storm destroyed crops, she was blamed. If men in positions of authority felt challenged, she was blamed. Women who had once been the backbone of communal resilience were turned into symbols of danger. The shift was not random. It served a purpose. Fear was a tool, and it was used with precision. The community became conditioned to associate female knowledge with risk, making it easier to justify harsher measures to silence them. The punishments grew stronger as the pressure intensified. Women who refused to relinquish their roles were threatened, beaten, exiled, or forced into rituals of humiliation meant to break their identity and discourage others from following their path. The violence was not contained to the physical world. It extended to the symbolic realm as well. Stories were spread portraying female healers as unstable or dangerous. The same hands that once saved lives were said to poison or corrupt them. This narrative instability created a climate where even family members began to question the women they had relied on for generations. And yet, even under these extreme conditions, fragments of resistance endured. Women continued to heal in secret, sharing remedies quietly, offering comfort in hidden spaces, and passing down techniques through coded words and rituals disguised as ordinary tasks. Their knowledge survived not because authority allowed it, but because communities still needed it, even if they feared admitting it openly. These acts of quiet defiance reveal how deeply rooted female knowledge remained, despite the systematic attempts to erase it. As you reflect on this, consider how different the world might look today if these women had not been targeted so deliberately. Their erasure was not accidental, but engineered, a necessary step for those who wished to rewrite power from the ground up. And the echoes of this violence would soon expand even further, reaching into areas of cultural memory where women had once shaped the very stories that defined their people. Before we continue, tell me something in the comments. What part of this historical suppression resonates with you most? Your perspective matters and helps keep this conversation alive as we move deeper into what was taken next. Once female healers and spiritual guides were discredited, the next assault turned toward something even more foundational: the systems of ritual, memory, and cultural transmission that women had preserved for centuries. These systems did not merely store information, they shaped how entire tribes understood themselves, organized their daily lives, and passed down the emotional architecture of their identity. When women led these practices, they maintained continuity across generations. They carried the stories of creation, the meaning of symbols, the interpretation of natural cycles, and the rituals that connected the community to its past. Dismantling these structures required more than banning ceremonies. It required severing the thread between women and the cultural knowledge they embodied. The process began with subtle interference. Male authorities introduced new interpretations of long-held traditions, claiming older practices were misguided or ineffective. They rewrote ceremonial roles, replacing female elders with male representatives who performed the rituals without understanding their deeper significance. This created rituals that looked familiar on the surface, but lacked the emotional and symbolic roots that once held the community together. The erosion happened not through immediate destruction, but through slow dilution. When meaning is drained from a tradition, it becomes easier to reshape it into a tool of control rather than a vessel of memory. Next came the systematic suppression of the knowledge. Women transmitted through stories, chants, and symbolic teachings. These narratives had preserved the wisdom of ancestors, encoded survival strategies, and reinforced the value of female guidance. When patriarchal groups sought dominance, they quickly recognized that controlling these stories was essential. So they replaced female-centered myths with altered versions that elevated male heroism and minimized or erased female influence. Characters once portrayed as protectors or creators were recast as passive, flawed, or dangerous. This revision was not simply literary. It reshaped how new generations interpreted the world and their place in it. The destruction intensified when female-led teachings were declared forbidden or morally corrupt. Songs that had been sung for centuries were silenced. Chants that guided healing or birth were outlawed. Objects used in rites of passage were seized or destroyed. Women who attempted to keep these practices alive were accused of subversion, forced into hiding, and sometimes punished with extraordinary cruelty. The new authorities understood that as long as women controlled the symbolic language of culture, their influence would endure. So they targeted the tools of memory one by one. Yet even under this pressure, women found ways to preserve fragments of what was taken. Some disguised traditional teachings as harmless household routines. Others encoded stories into metaphors and lullabies, hiding ancestral wisdom in plain sight. Few passed down rituals through gestures and repeated actions that carried meaning only to those taught to understand them. These quiet acts of survival reveal the depth of resilience within cultures under assault. While official narratives erased women from leadership, the true memory of the tribe continued to pulse beneath the surface, carried by those who refused to let it die. The more these systems were targeted, the more the community's identity shifted without realizing it. What had once been a world held together by female continuity became a landscape defined by absence, where people sensed something missing but could not name it. This loss created the perfect environment for even harsher forms of domination to take root, especially as women who still carried influence through community support, kinship ties, or ancestral authority became the next targets of suppression, facing forms of punishment that would redefine fear across entire generations. As the symbolic and ritual foundations held by women were being erased, another transformation began beneath the surface, one that operated not through direct violence, but through the reprogramming of cultural memory. To completely dismantle female authority, Those in power needed more than control over stories and ceremonies. They needed to reshape how entire generations perceived women themselves. This required a slow but devastating psychological shift, a rewriting of the emotional associations tied to female leadership. Over time, women who once embodied stability, wisdom, and continuity were recast as unstable, unpredictable, or inherently unfit for authority. This recalibration of perception was subtle, but it spread through every aspect of community life with alarming efficiency. Children who once learned their first stories from mothers and grandmothers were now taught new narratives where female figures appeared only in background roles, stripped of influence or portrayed as cautionary examples. Boys were instructed to distrust the authority of women, while girls were taught to silence their own instincts and accept limited roles as natural and unchangeable. These teachings did not need to be harsh to be effective. Repetition alone accomplished what force could not. By normalizing a world where women led nothing, the new systems made the memory of female power almost unimaginable. A person cannot fight for what they have been trained to believe never existed. This reconditioning extended into daily life as well. Women were systematically excluded from group decisions, not through explicit bans, but through constant reinforcement of the idea that their voices were irrelevant. When they spoke, they were ignored. When they offered insight, it was dismissed. When they questioned injustice, they were labeled troublesome. Over time, the emotional weight of these interactions reshaped how people responded instinctively to female authority. The community began to behave as though women's knowledge held no value, even though only a generation earlier it had been the backbone of their survival. The most insidious element was how internalized the new beliefs became. Women began doubting themselves, apologizing for their own competence, and hiding their abilities to avoid punishment or ridicule. The psychological damage of this internal erosion was immense, not because it silenced women outright, but because it made them question their right to exist in the roles they had once held with confidence. When a society convinces its members to police themselves, the need for overt punishment diminishes. The work of erasure happens from within. Yet despite this massive reprogramming effort, traces of the old world endured. A gesture copied unconsciously from a grandmother. A lesson whispered by an aunt during a moment of quiet. A ritual performed instinctively by a mother comforting a child. These small inheritances resisted the imposed order, reminding those who paid attention that something deeper ran beneath the surface of the new hierarchy. The persistence of these quiet fragments revealed that even when stories are rewritten and rituals suppressed, the memory of female leadership never fully disappears. It lingers in the body, in the instincts, in the rhythms of daily life that cannot be entirely controlled. As these cracks in the imposed order widened, the new authorities responded with an even harsher set of tactics aimed directly at women who continued to hold influence through their natural presence, their community ties, or their ability to inspire unity. The next wave of suppression did not rely on subtle manipulation or symbolic erasure. It introduced a far more brutal form of punishment designed to break the social backbone of tribes and extinguish the last visible traces of female authority. When subtle manipulation could no longer contain the fragments of female influence that refused to disappear, the emerging power structures escalated into open brutality. Women who still held respect within their communities, whether through kinship, healing abilities, or natural leadership, became direct targets of public punishment. These acts were not spontaneous. They were strategic, calibrated to create fear so deep that the community itself learned to enforce the new hierarchy out of self-preservation. Authorities understood that as long as certain women continued to serve as emotional anchors or symbols of resilience, the old world survived in the shadows. So they sought to destroy these symbols in ways that would reverberate through generations. The methods varied, but the intention was always the same: to sever the bond between women and their communities. Some were dragged before councils and accused of crimes no one believed, but everyone feared. Others were isolated, shamed, or forced into humiliating rituals meant to redefine their identity as powerless. Punishments were performed publicly, not simply to discipline the women involved, but to teach the community what happened when anyone resisted the imposed order. The spectacle of fear replaced the quiet strength once embodied by female figures. The message was clear. Even the most respected women could be broken if they dared hold influence. But physical punishment was only part of the strategy. Psychological degradation amplified the damage. Women were forced to confess to offenses they never committed, pressured to renounce roles they had inherited from generations before them, and compelled to declare themselves unworthy of leadership. These forced declarations reverberated throughout the tribe, reshaping beliefs not through truth, but through terror. People began to distance themselves from the punished women, not because they doubted their integrity, but because they feared becoming the next target. Isolation became a weapon more effective than any physical blow. Families were torn apart as children were taught to distrust the women who had raised them, and husbands were encouraged to withdraw support to avoid suspicion. This fracturing of social bonds served the new hierarchy perfectly. A community divided against itself cannot protect its leaders, especially when those leaders are women. The more isolated these women became, the easier it was to erase their influence, not just in daily life, but in collective memory. After all, once a community abandons its symbols of strength, it becomes much easier to rewrite its history. Yet even in the harshest moments, the resilience of these women persisted in small, almost invisible ways. A glance exchanged during punishment, a whispered blessing to a child, a stubborn refusal to break under humiliation. These were not grand acts of rebellion, but the quiet proof that the old values had not completely died. The new authorities recognized the danger in even these subtle gestures. The more fiercely they tried to crush them, the more they revealed the depth of what they feared losing. And this fear shaped the next stage of suppression, one aimed not just at punishing individual women, but at dismantling the remaining cultural frameworks that carried traces of female authority. What followed was a calculated attack on how communities understood knowledge, identity, and belonging, pushing the erasure into territories that touched the very core of human continuity. Before we go on, tell me something in the comments. Which part of this suppression strikes you the most, and why? Your thoughts help illuminate the weight of what was taken as we explore how this destruction continued to deepen. As the punishments grew harsher and public displays of domination reshaped the emotional landscape of entire communities, a deeper and more strategic transformation unfolded behind the scenes. The new authorities understood that physical violence alone could not secure long-term control. Fear loses its power if people remember what life looked like before it arrived. So the next phase focused on reshaping identity at its core, altering how people interpreted knowledge, lineage, and belonging. If women had once been the keepers of these foundations, then dismantling those foundations required replacing them with new systems that made the old ones seem foreign or impossible to reclaim. This shift began with a quiet reorganization of who was allowed to teach and who was allowed to learn. Women who had once educated children, guided adolescents through rites of passage, and served as the living memory of the tribe were gradually pushed away from these roles. Their teachings were labeled outdated or dangerous, while male figures were elevated as the official bearers of knowledge. This did not simply change who spoke, it changed what was considered truth. Over time, the worldview of entire communities was rebuilt around narratives that justified the erasure of women, presenting male-centered structures as natural and unquestionable. What had been a balanced system became a narrow version of reality that left no space for the past that women had shaped. Language itself became a tool of erasure. Words that once described female authority disappeared from daily speech. Terms for positions held by women were abandoned or reassigned to men. Even metaphors changed, shifting from symbols rooted in creation and balance to symbols rooted in conquest and hierarchy. This linguistic reprogramming mattered because language defines what a society believes is possible. If there is no word for a woman leader, it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine one. The transformation worked silently, embedding new beliefs so deeply that they shaped instinct rather than thought. At the same time, the lineage structure of tribal life underwent deliberate distortion. Communities that had once traced ancestry through female lines were taught to dismiss these connections as insignificant. Inheritance, authority, and identity shifted toward male lineage, altering not only how families operated, but how individuals understood their place within the community. This shift fractured networks of support that had once been held together by women, leaving individuals more dependent on the very systems that oppressed them. The loss of matrilineal identity did not just erase the past, it created a new future where the old balance could not easily return. Cultural artifacts that once carried female symbolism were destroyed, repurposed, or stripped of their meaning. Objects that preserved memory through design, color, or ritual use were replaced with new items that reinforced the patriarchal order. Even when people could still see the remnants of their old culture, they no longer recognized the significance behind them. This disconnection from symbols and meanings acted like a severed nerve, cutting communities off from the emotional and spiritual continuity that female leadership had long provided. But, even in the midst of this deep rewriting, something persisted. People continued to feel a subtle tension, a sense that the new structures did not fully align with their instincts. That quiet dissonance often emerged at unexpected moments. A mother's gesture, a grandmother's story told in a whisper, an old symbol that continued to appear in dreams or in unexplained moments of intuition. These remnants did not openly defy the imposed order, but they hinted at an older framework, still alive beneath. The surface, shaping consciousness in ways the new authorities feared but could not entirely extinguish. It was this lingering presence, this unspoken memory of what had been, that led the new power systems to expand their suppression even further, targeting not only the identity of the community, but the very knowledge systems that once empowered women to interpret the cycles of life, illness, and survival. This next stage would deepen the rupture between past and present, pushing the destruction into places where even silence could not fully hide what had been taken. By the time these systemic erasures had taken hold, the consequences extended far beyond ritual, education, or leadership. Entire lines of knowledge and skill that had been cultivated and safeguarded by women for generations were now at risk of disappearing completely. The methods of survival, the understanding of plants and medicines, the intricate knowledge of local environments, and even the organizational wisdom that had allowed communities to thrive were devalued, suppressed, or deliberately obscured. What had once been a shared pool of practical and spiritual intelligence became fragmented, as male-centered systems dismissed female knowledge as anecdotal, superstitious, or irrelevant to the new structures of authority. This loss was particularly devastating because so much of female knowledge was experiential and transmitted orally or through practice, rather than written texts. The absence of recognition or documentation made it especially vulnerable to erasure. When women were removed from their positions of teaching or guidance, the information they carried could vanish within a generation. Skills in herbal medicine, midwifery, conflict mediation, and seasonal planning were often lost, replaced with simplified or distorted versions aligned with patriarchal priorities. Communities were left not only bereft of their past guidance, but also increasingly dependent on external authority for information that had once been safeguarded internally. The social repercussions were equally severe. When the knowledge and authority of women were dismissed, a vacuum formed that disrupted the cohesion of the community. Decisions that had been guided by experience and collective wisdom became centralized in fewer hands, often held by those lacking the nuanced understanding women had provided. Mistakes multiplied, conflicts escalated, and previously sustainable systems of resource management and communal well-being weakened. The shift created dependence and vulnerability, reshaping the balance of power in ways that ensured male dominance at every level of society. Even cultural memory suffered. Stories, rituals, and songs that encoded historical knowledge and moral guidance were altered or abandoned. Male-centered narratives emphasized conquest, hierarchy, and obedience, while female-centered lessons about community, healing, and continuity faded into whispers or disappeared entirely. Over time, the collective memory of societies adapted to these new narratives, making it increasingly difficult to remember or even imagine the roles women once played. By suppressing both practical knowledge and symbolic memory, the new authorities effectively rewrote the past, leaving a version of history where female leadership appeared exceptional, anomalous, or entirely absent. Yet traces of what had been persisted in subtle, almost invisible ways. Women who continued to pass on. Knowledge did so discreetly, teaching essential skills through small acts, quiet corrections, or coded gestures. These fragments, though reduced and hidden, ensured that not all wisdom was lost. Communities retained the potential to recover insights and practices if the opportunity arose. The suppression was extensive, but it could not completely extinguish the intelligence, resilience, and memory that had once flourished under female guidance. And so, even as the structures of female authority were dismantled, the remnants continued to linger beneath the surface, awaiting the moment when memory could once again rise. The next stage of this historical arc would reveal how these hidden fragments persisted in ways that would influence both culture and survival, quietly resisting the full weight of the imposed order and setting the stage for the final reckoning of what was erased and what could never be forgotten. By the time the full scope of these systematic suppressions had been realized, the loss of female leadership in tribal societies was both visible and invisible, tangible in the absence of women in positions of authority, and subtle in the erasure of knowledge that once guided entire communities. The threads of culture, practice, and memory that women maintained for generations had been severed, leaving gaps that would echo across time. Yet even in this environment of destruction, resilience endured. Hidden rituals, whispered teachings, and the quiet acts of those who refused to relinquish their knowledge persisted, carrying fragments of wisdom through the shadows. These remnants served as a living reminder that, no matter how thoroughly systems sought to erase them, the influence of women could not be entirely extinguished. What is striking is how much of our modern understanding of history has been shaped by these very erasures. The absence of female authority in recorded accounts does not indicate absence in reality. It reflects the deliberate rewriting of memory and the silencing of voices that once commanded respect, wisdom, and power. Every hidden practice preserved in secrecy, every ritual passed down in whispers, stands as proof that resistance existed, that influence survived, and that history is more layered than what official records convey. The traces of these women, often invisible to outsiders, shaped the resilience of communities in ways that are only now beginning to be appreciated. As you reflect on this, it becomes clear that understanding the full magnitude of what was lost is not merely an academic exercise. It is a recognition of the deliberate violence, the strategies of suppression, and the enduring legacy of those who refused to disappear completely. These lessons remind us that the stories we are told are only part of the picture, and that memory, resilience, and quiet resistance often exist in the spaces left unrecorded. The true impact of what was destroyed stretches far beyond what is visible, influencing social structures, knowledge systems, and cultural continuity for generations. If this exploration has revealed something that resonates with you, take a moment to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Perhaps this story was for me, or I see what was lost now, to show that you've engaged with the depth of these hidden histories. Give the video a like if it opened your eyes, and if you aren't already, Consider subscribing so you can continue uncovering the stories that have been deliberately erased from our shared past. There's more waiting just beyond this point. Stories that connect the resilience of women to the enduring consequences we see today.